So, Calvin, welcome.
Hello, Maylis.
I'm really happy to see you and really, really happy to have this conversation.
No, thank you. I am excited that you wanted to have this conversation with me.
Yeah, I am too. And one of the reasons actually I wanted to have this chat with you is because I've always wondered, always had this question, like knowing you, like how does someone who's lived, within multiple systems of harm, not just based on the work that you do, but where you come from and how you support others through those systems, how do you actually come to relate to conflict, to recovery, and the cultures that actually hold us or fail us? So when we'll be speaking to people who probably don't know who you are, so I wanted to take this opportunity to ask you, introduce yourself, but looking at it from the frame of who are you today, who's Calvin today, and how would you introduce yourself outside of your bio?
Sure. So I think I am someone who is passionate, someone who is intuitive, someone who has a strong sense of justice. I am someone who sits in multiple intersections of oppression. So being gay, being black, having neurodivergence, or neurodiversity, and I would say an immigrant in the fact that I wasn't born in the UK, even though the country I've come from is British. So that's who I am outside of my bio, and I think all of those things kind of impact my life view and the work that I've chosen to take on.
Yeah, I love how you just shared all of those identities, right? And it's almost like a canvas, but my mind straight away goes to, intersectionality, since this is like a subject that you and I love quite a bit. And thinking about all of those different identities and how they merge, where there might be harmony and maybe conflict. I'd be curious to know how has your relationship with conflict shaped who you're becoming?
Yeah, so I think I was just thinking about that again today, and I think I've always had growing up, I had a resistance to conflict. I didn't really enjoy conflict, and I think when you grow up with these different intersectional identities, I think you often feel like you are always under attack. As Audre Lorde says, I'm always part of a group that is considered deviant or wrong, right? And so you always feel like you're in this place where you either have to defend yourself or you have to stick up for yourself. And that wasn't something that I was ever comfortable with, right? And that I would actually shy away from. So growing up, I didn't really like conflict, and then growing up, what I noticed was how people in systems were being harmed, and I felt like I wanted to do something about that. So I have a better relationship with advocating or conflict than I am advocating for other people, more so than myself. So the interpersonal conflicts I still struggle with, but I think I am more drawn to conflicts of social justice.
Yeah.
So I just lost my train of thought for a second.
No. Because you said that, you didn't like conflict growing up, and you talked about like being on defense and how sometimes, coming and existing within all of those identities puts you in a position where you actually are under attack, but essentially you have to defend yourself. It's really interesting, and I think we'll get into it as well.
Yeah.
Somehow, somewhere you find yourself in the field of social justice, advocating more for others than for yourself. But it's very interesting. I find that people who understand harm, who've been exposed to harm, are usually the best translators, in those spaces where it may seem obvious how the dynamics are shaped, but unless you've lived it, you can't quite kind of attune yourself to the real nuances within that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think in those situations when I was growing up and when you are living within those intersections, I think you often feel disempowered, right? And that's what I was about to say earlier. You end up feeling disempowered, and you realize that a lot of conflict has to deal with power and power structures, and having to find your power allows you to kind of deal with those type of conflicts, especially for structural conflicts.
Yeah.
I think confidence and self-esteem, I think, are sources of power that help with interpersonal conflicts. And I guess that's probably where I'm still struggling. But I think, I think this is how I came into understanding how power and control is very much at play in any conflict.
Yeah. And you stole like almost the word out of my mouth, and which is like one of the big words in this conversation, I think, will be around power. And the way I wanted to kind of run this conversation with you as well is like if we were reading through like a book and looking at culture, power, but exploring conflict through different chapters that relate specifically to who you are and how you work through the world, right? And the first chapter, like in my mind, was really looking at culture, power, as you said earlier, and social contract. So when I think about that, and it's based on the conversations that we had before, that we have a certain understanding that the rules were written before we arrived, right, on this planet. Some of us were born, after centuries of historical contracts being created through which we walked in based on the color of our skin, trying to understand and navigate what that means now. So I want to talk about what happens when we actually start to question those contracts. And maybe looking at it from within and then expanding without. So the first question is, how do you understand the idea of culture within yourself, within your work and society?
I think culture, definitely influences a large part of who I am. And I think we have different levels of culture, right? I think, for example, there was a very specific culture within my immediate family, and then maybe a very similar culture maybe within my more extended family. And these are things of religious practices and all of those things, right? And what is expected of individuals who are within this family. And then you have community culture, the culture in which you were raised in. So, coming from Bermuda, there's a very particular culture that's very much rooted in Christianity and expectations of what is right and what is wrong, respectability, and all of those things. And I think all of those things kind of have shaped who I was and who I am now. So I think, that was my understanding. So when I kind of, in these settings now where I'm trying to still advocate for others, I have to be mindful of the culture that I was brought up in, and be mindful of, some things that always get me is this idea of what is respectable, right? Because Bermuda is very much Christian, and we have these ideas of what is respectable. You have to dress a certain way, and sometimes that respectability in the context of advocating for people in conflict, I think can become a barrier. Or it can sometimes be helpful, but it's by understanding that is there and that's part of my culture. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong. And I think when we work within our culture, I think it's important to understand that there are others and other ways of doing things, other cultures that are also interplaying with, especially within conflicts.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I think of my culture in that context. Is that it shapes maybe how I see things, but and at times I might need to reflect on it, build on it, or even tear it down.
Wow. That's pretty powerful because visually I can actually see that. Like, are you stepping on it? Are you, or actually tearing it down in a way? So really keeping a sense of what's useful in the moment and what's not. And I'm really curious because if we talk about now the wider society and Western society specifically, right, and the dominant contracts that live within that, actually are exercised within that society. Could be social, could be racial, legal, and how that shapes harm and conflict today. And if you reflect on that as well, based on where you come from, how might that be at odds as well as in terms of how you understand, these dominant contracts?
Yeah, so I think it's part of understanding where we are in society and the conflicts that we are facing, especially when we look at things around misogyny and race and racism and stuff like that. I think we really need to understand that a lot of these structures, or a lot of these structures kind of contribute to these conflicts. And I think and I think it's important for us to understand that these structures were set up long before any of us, right? Back in the 1700s, I'm not exactly sure then, but when people were starting to have these ideas of social constructs, right? Social contracts and all of that type of thing. And basically what that process was determining people's roles in society. Who and where they were placed in society. If they were placed at the head, top, if they had more power, if they were placed to the margins or just outside of society. These are the things that were taking place, centuries ago, right? And without any thought about that, we have to realize that their structures are still put in place. So a woman's role in society was determined back in the 18 or 1700s. Men's roles, children's roles, LGBTQ people, everyone's roles were determined years ago, and I think we have to start to question whether or not there's contracts and there's agreements still serve us today, or if they are, if they need to be challenged. And I think we also need to recognize how pervasive those contracts actually permeated cultures. So if we think about the medical industry, and there were certain things that were just thought about, or there are certain perceptions of black people within the medical fields that were based on these type of structures and constructs. They were used as disposable guinea pigs, to kind of advance medicine. But there was also thoughts of black people that we didn't suffer pain as much, and our lung capacity was different, and all of these things which are scientifically not true, right? But they were based in these constructs and these ideas of how of who is worthy of society, of who is worthy within society in their place. And I think we still see that in the modern day discourse when we're talking about whether or not people are gay or bisexual or lesbian, or whether or not they're trans. Black people are still suffering from those inadequacies and marginalizations. And I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the conflict is based on retaining those power structures, right? And the people who have the power, and the people who are saying that we need to retain these power structures, are the people who have set it up.
You know what? I I find it really fascinating, right? How all of these systems feed into each other, right? Because we talk about social constructs, and then we think about these roles that are assigned for individuals within societies, and then how these individuals need to now, like, become productive members of this society. It all goes back to economic systems, political systems. And I think about capitalism, right? Because we think about the roles as a baseline, and then how we all generate output, how we all generate value within a system that's already outlined, where there are some who are placed at a higher standard or higher level, and others who are much lower. We're called to actually bring value, yet again, all said to be equal when in practice we're not. I'm really curious how this world of, in this system, this capitalistic system itself, what is its kind of, in your opinion anyway, like what's its particular strand of the way it shapes harm? Like how does it color, this same picture that we've been exploring from the social contracts of the past that are still here, present, but what's the spin, like, that's capitalism adding into the way we perceive harm?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you're absolutely correct. And I think the way I see it is that there are people, the way societies have been set up is that there are people who benefit from society, and then there are people that serve society. Right? So there are the workers, there are the people, the factory workers, the people who just basically make sure that society is ticking along, and then there are people who are basically benefiting from all of those resources, right? Benefiting from the work that's being put in, benefiting from the structures that are being put in place, and they're able to build on their resources. And the people who are just making sure that society keeps ticking along are basically just staying in the same place, right? And I think that's what capitalism is about. It's about those who serve society and those that benefit from society, right? When you talk about capitalism, it's this great thing where people can achieve, great wealth, but not everybody can achieve the same wealth. Not everybody has the same skill sets. There are some people that just need to be nurses or doctors or bus drivers and stuff like that, right? So the reality is that there are people who are meant to serve and there are people who are meant to benefit. And I think when you have a system of service and benefit, then the people who are in service are going to be often harmed, right? Because they're not seen as valuable. They are valuable. They're probably the most valuable, because if the workers and the working class stopped, then capitalism would stop, right? This whole system would basically just crumble, right? So, which is why it needs to continue, and which is why the everyone is so, or the people who are benefiting need for it to continue. But in that continuation, that we're continuously seeing harm, even within charity society, in charity work, right? There's still that idea of service and benefit, right? People who are being harmed and people who are benefiting, right? And often people who work within charity sectors aren't being well paid, but they're taking up the slack of what systems are, the gaps that the systems have left. And creating, again, harms within the people who are working within charity sections, harm within people who are working within service industries, whether it's nurses or doctors or bus drivers or teachers. It's always the people who contribute the most to society who end up feeling the most harm. And we see that in, with a lot of the industrial type of conversations of what is right for the workers. And I think the way it's set up is that there will always be harm as long as there's that system of benefit and service. it's kind of very similar to the slavery kind of structure, right? You can't say that slaves weren't harmed. Now, just because now people can make money doesn't mean that they're not being harmed. Just because they are able to, be self-sufficient doesn't mean that the harm has been taken away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to me, it's like, where are we really placing, what is the objective here? And when we think about capitalism, the objective is to make money, and we seldom pay attention on, as to what the process looks like, right? It's like that, this by any means necessary kind of mindset. And there's a glorification of that, of like, you must work hard, you must, be devoted, and what kind of the cost is on ourselves, the cost is on community, and to me, the cost is also on history, because if we think about conflict as something that's kind of culture making, what I've come to see is that, like, the conflict isn't really the fire. It's like that spark that shows us where the oxygen is, and I think the oxygen we're all seeking is power. Because if you think about every movement, every culture is somehow always questioning who has power, who doesn't have power. Right, it was really fascinating. Recently, I was reading something on LinkedIn, and it was saying how the UK is like emptying itself of all its millionaires, and they're all moving to Dubai and stuff because of the taxes that they have to pay. And they were saying how there's a real challenge in the UK because they're not able to have conversations around wealth and around money. And my thinking was like, oh, well, no wonder they're not, because if we start having conversations about wealth, we're asking who has this wealth, why do they have it, since when do they have it, and then if there's like a nouveau riche, or like the new class that's building wealth, how are they getting about to getting that? And at the end of the day, we need to kind of sit down and say, but who do we want to be, even as people who are wealthy living amongst people who are not so wealthy? But it feels like we want to isolate each other and say, we are part of this group. We may have power, although we may not want you to know exactly how much power we have. So if I think about that, for me, and based on everything that you've said as well, it's like we want to start understanding where the harm lives and maybe where the healing begins. And I want us in this kind of next chapter to kind of dive a bit more into the work that you do, right? Because if I think about your field of work, it's quite... it amasses so much. It's like health, advocacy, anti-violence. They talk about sexual violence as well, right? So what would it look like to actually, move from like a culture that is not quickly canceling when we start identifying the harm and the perpetrators, but actually, how do we even think about healing, right? Because it's so complicated, because we can't isolate the perpetrators, because at the end of the day, the impact that they have is on the victims. But cancel culture doesn't allow us to go deep. But in your perspective, if we're talking about harm, identifying it, but also addressing it appropriately, what do we do? How do we do this when we know that cancel culture is very much like what we've instilled, and healing culture is still... no one knows what to do with it, even if you think it exists, actually.
Yeah, so I think the way societies have been set up, how we were just talking about capitalism and stuff like that, it makes it harder for people to take accountability, right? Because if people start taking accountability for the harm that they do, usually that usually comes with a financial price, right? And I'm not saying and that is appropriate, or some type of restoration should be done, whether it's financial and stuff, or whether it's other sources. I think also the way society is structured, financial restoration goes a long way, right, to healing and to being able to cope with the harm that you've experienced. I think it's hard to kind of talk about healing within a culture of capitalism, right? I think, and I think people who have the power are going to kind of like hold on to, are going to try and hold on to their power. I think it's a, but we have to find a way to. I think you're absolutely right about. So I'm just thinking this through again. I think you're right about how do we go through so people can take responsibility and are not cancelled. I think grace, I think, is also important. Giving people grace, allowing people to grow, allowing people the space to kind of learn and to make amends. I think it has to be a conversation with the people who are involved. I think we often get involved in other people's conflicts and expect certain outcomes, and that might not even be the outcome that the victim even wants, right? So I think grace is very important. I think being able to facilitate some type of conversation between the two parties, I think in a way that kind of like levels the power dynamic, which again would be very difficult in a structure of capitalism and patriarchy and all of the other issues that we have. But I think there's a group in Africa that kind of does it really well, and I had read about this earlier when I was preparing for this conversation. I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was about the community kind of gets together and kind of like talks it out, right? Yeah. And then there's like a lead. I'm trying to remember what country that was, but the league kind of like facilitates it. But it's the community is involved, and the community, including the people who are involved in the actual conflict, and they come to these agreements, right? And within which the whole community kind of like agrees to, as well as the victim and the perpetrator. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I think that kind of like levels the playing field. And yeah, it levels the playing field, and it kind of takes it kind of yeah. I think I was getting a bit yeah. I think it really levels the playing field.
Yeah, I mean, someone's getting loud over there talking about conflict. What's your dog on?
He's found the conflict of his own.
He's found a conflict of his own. But you know what? This piece about grace, I find that when we look at it from like an individual perspective and we're extending grace to someone who's caused harm, that's one thing. And I wanted to get your perspective on this. What does it look like when you think about extending grace towards, I mean, is that even a thing? Like, institutional powers, because you know what I mean, because I think sometimes there's the individual, and we know that systems are made by a group of individuals. Sometimes we can't see, we can't identify, and this is the thing that's so overwhelming sometimes. If you've been a victim and you're expecting justice, and you desire justice, there's a series and a whole heap of people who you don't see, who are reading your information, who are processing, your story without you necessarily connecting with them. But how do you extend grace sometimes when you still feel wronged, but you don't know who, you know what I mean? There's that part of institutions are sometimes, hiding things that we don't see, and yet we're expected to trust in them. And yet a big part of the harm that I believe I see in our general societies anyway, is that we also feel wronged by systems and institutions. How does that even play a part? Because you can't cancel, it's very hard to cancel an institution. You can cancel an individual, but you can't cancel an institution in some cases. So how do we even reconcile when there's still that big dynamic of power when individuals we can extend grace to, but when it comes to institutions, how do we even begin to find, as you said, restoration? How does restorative practices happen when it's one individual against an institution?
Yeah, it's and I keep saying it's hard, but I think
it is.
There has to be. It is very hard, and I think I'm just okay. So what came to my mind is the institution of policing, right? Mm-hmm. And the policing, to some people, have a very necessary role in society. Yeah. But that role comes with trust, right? We have to have trust within the police in order for them to be effective. And so with that trust, and with all that has happened, the history of police, we have to give them grace in order for them to perform their duties, right? In order to allow them to go about their day to day, right? However, it's difficult when the police don't listen to you, right? When the police utilize their power to silence you. And that's quite difficult. And I don't know how much grace you can give in that type of situation. It reminded me of this conversation I had with somebody, or a number of conversations I was having with somebody on social media, where they actually worked for the police, and they were supposed to be the DEI president back then. DEI was acceptable, and they were a black president, and a lot of their rhetoric on Twitter or social media was very much anti-black. And I would challenge them, and this is somebody that I knew. I would challenge them, and he would say, "Well, you don't like what I'm saying, and don't look at my posts and all of that." And I was never rude. I was never disrespectful. I just challenged their points to the point that they blocked me. The reason I'm saying that is because I wasn't looking at their social media posts to be angered. I was looking at their social media posts to hold them accountable. And if people who have these positions aren't willing to be held accountable and use their power to block you, then we're not going to get anywhere, right? We're not going to be able to have these very difficult conversations that are necessary. And just because you're tired or you don't want to hear it, you shut it down. That's not how we're going to get forward. And that's kind of why I like that African practice, because everyone has to sit there and have that conversation until the conversation is over, until there's a resolution. We don't do that nowadays. We don't sit there and face it. We say, "Oh, you offended me. I'm walking out the door. Oh, I've got power. I don't have to take this. I'm walking out the door." And so I think that's where I think there has to be grace. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how. And it's partially not for me to figure that out, because I don't have the power. Right? The people who have the power have to decide, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to listen to actually what's being said. I mean, politicians, their role was supposed to be to speak for the people, and all they seem to do is speak for the powers. They're not listening to the people anymore, right? The Labour Party, who was supposed to be the party of the people, are not listening to the people. But most parties aren't listening to people.
This is a great point. I think essentially, like what I heard you say was how we're so quick to shut down discourse, and to the point about the African kind of model. This is something I've been researching a lot about. Especially because I have two cultures, within Africa, but there's one of them which is called Akan culture, and they have a specific model of conflict resolution. And it is very much rooted in discourse, but it's not also, it's progressive because there's always a listening ear at every level of society, because there is a hierarchy where there are kings and chiefs, but it means on the level of the community, there are people who can already be a listening ear to what's going on the ground before it escalates, right? And this for me is like my main challenge with Western culture, and one that I've grown to understand more and more. Why it doesn't feel right in my body, what it doesn't sit right with me, is because it's not, my being doesn't align with that, right? Because when you come from communities that have a different understanding, that are very much relational as opposed to transactional, the way we handle and we dismiss and we shut down discourse in the West, it's brutal. And so the next kind of chapter of this conversation for me is like, how do we explore recovery and the cost of belonging? And as you were saying, this model of like, oh, yeah, I don't have power, I'm walking away, or I don't like what you're saying, I'm shutting you down. We can see that also in the workplace. Specifically, if you think about every conflict that's emerged in the last 5 years surrounding DEI and how we come to perceive inclusion, it's like there's one camp that's saying, oh my God, DEI is raising up words that are really offensive. It's raising up history that's super offensive. I feel triggered. I don't want to confront this privilege that I may or may not have. This is too offensive. I can't deal with it. And there's another, group that's saying there is harm that's historically been caused, and this harm is perpetuated still to this day. And we are living this in our bodies, and still we're facing this in our workplaces, in all the systems that we engage in. And unless we address the harm, we can't move forward. There's no middle ground, almost, to the point where now, like, no one is saying DEI. Like, we've defined another word, and everyone's calling it fair. It's like, I can't help but feel like, our cultures, and specifically in the West, like, they harm. When we think about harm, it's like processed like paperwork. You know what I mean? It's like, shift it, move it. So healing really doesn't stand a chance, So if we think about recovery and what it would mean to actually center the person and recovery, like, I want us to get into that a little bit, because from your perspective, like, what does true recovery mean, like, for people who've experienced harm? And I really want to hone in on this workplace piece, because I know you and I, we've had our experiences, but looking back at where you came from and where you are today, like, what do you think, like, actually recovery could look like in that space when you take that perspective of people, individuals who've been harmed?
I think first we have to make the difference, point out the difference between someone who's been harmed, wanting restoration and wanting to be heard, and people who have caused the harm feeling uncomfortable, right? Because I think sometimes when we don't acknowledge that these are two different things and they require two different responses from each person, I think we kind of conflate the two. So when we talk about healing, then we can sometimes talk about, wow, I can't experience harm as an oppressor by listening to how I have oppressed you, right? Instead of putting first the harm that has been caused by the oppression, and allowing that person to be heard, and allowing that person's healing, and also not requiring that person to do all of the heavy lifting. So when I think about rest, when it comes to people who are resisting or who have experienced oppression and harm, I think that's very important. And but on the flip side, there's a lot of work that the people who oppress need to do. And I think that's the conversations that we need to have. Not everybody, you can't like we can't have everybody just taking a step back, right? Some people need to take a step back because they need that healing. Some people need to take a step forward because they need to step in and kind of pull up the slack. I think that's part of the conversation that a lot of people don't want to have, and you can hear it now when we hear, oh, white people are being oppressed, white people are being, all of this type of stuff. And that's not true. Statistics don't say that. And also the reality is that you should be required to step forward and to kind of address what has happened, and allow healing for people who have been oppressed. I think also, how does healing happen? I think sometimes, as people who have been oppressed, I think it's important that we understand our limits, and we understand when we need to get out, right?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, especially when I'm thinking about the work situations, and I stayed longer than I should have, and I caused more harm to myself by staying, because I wanted some type of justice, that I not only did not get that justice, but I ended up prolonging the harm that was happening to me. So I think it's really important for us to understand when enough is enough. Also, it's really important to kind of know where your resources and your strengths are, like your community, right? How to ask for help. If you need mental health support, go for it. If whatever structures or support you need, being able to address and find those support. One of the things that happened to me was around my learning difficulty, and where I was being treated unfairly. I had no idea of the resources that were available, and neither was my employer letting me know resources that were available, right? So I think it's really important for us to try and figure out those resources and find our networks and our supports in family, in community, and knowing when you can be helped.
Yes. You know what? What I heard from this and the way you framed it, it's almost like a recovery pathway and considerations for the individual as well, right? All of these kids, community, family, resources. At the same time, I want us to kind of look at it, because if we're looking at the dual perspective of the individual recovering and also the organization and how it recovers, I find it's really interesting, because what we see, and this is something that you shared to me, it's like the organization usually recovers and bounces back, because when there is an individual within the system who's flagging something that's not going right, and this individual becomes a threat, the organization has a way of just rapidly protecting itself. And my concern, and this is something that I see often in my own practice, actually, what do we lose when we actually measure harm through policy and not humanity? Because it's like there is no... I often feel like at the height of organizations, those who are oftentimes like the security guards, when the time comes to show up and to face the harm, we lose every sense of humanity and we fall back on policy and guardrails, and the best way to not expose ourselves to it. So what are we, in your experience anyway, what do you feel from what you've experienced in the past? What is actually lost when we operate from that model of policy versus humanity?
Well, I just want to make the correction that I think organizations recover their reputation. I don't know if they necessarily recover, because I think if they, or maybe organizations, it's not for them to recover, it might be for them to change. And I think that's what we lose when we are so focused on policies and stuff like that, is that we lose the opportunity to grow and to be more of a humane society, more of a humane and just organization, right? Because they end up, trying to protect their reputation. It's all about their reputation, right? It's not about, because they're not really being injured, right? It's the person, the employee, right, who's being injured, but they need to be protected. and that protection means that they're unable to grow, to learn, and to just make a society in her, in large, a better place.
Yeah, it's so true. I like that distinction you made, as opposed to recover. It's potentially change, and for me, I often look at it as the way we started the conversation, looking at culture within and also culture without, and within organizations there is a culture there.
Definitely.
And what it would mean to actually have cultures that promote recovery is everywhere, when I'm called for work, it's like, okay, right, we have a conflict, we need to resolve it. And we often think, okay, if we can get the tools to address the conflict and air it out, now it's addressed. But there's often rarely a reflection that comes with the sustainable nature of relationships that have endured conflict and what recovery looks like, because it's not just after impact. Great if you address something after impact and there's some form of resolution or conversation, but to me it's what happens afterwards, right? This can become a learning curve, so you can create cultures that are more resilient, actually hold space for conflict. But rarely do we do that. We keep those conflicts in isolation, and the individuals who have faced the conflict, either they stay or one leaves, the other one stays, or both of them leave. But I think people often forget that the impact, those traces are etched in within the culture of that workplace. Even if every other employee wasn't there when the conflict was happening, it will have a ripple effect, because that feeds into, I think, the active DNA that companies are building on a day-to-day when they either choose to avoid, or they choose to face, or they choose to address and become transparent. There's all of these really interesting dynamics to me that are rarely considered when we think about conflict at work.
And it's also the longevity of the work that they do, right? Especially if you remember around 2020 with the George Floyd, everyone was, there were so many jokes for EDI. it was like every organization was trying to, it was so, they were plentiful and bountiful, right? And and I remember shortly thereafter getting a job around changing the culture of a particular organization, and without any resources, right? They didn't put any resources behind the work. And within 9 months, I was out of there, right? Because apparently, they said I wasn't doing the work, but actually, as I said to them, it's not my work to do, it's the organization's work to do. And then they just kind of like stopped, right? And went back to normal. And probably worse than they were before 2020 in my eyes. But I think that's the important thing to also discuss, is like making these lasting changes, and that has to be about values. That has to be about what you believe in, your belief system. That's how you change culture, by changing your values and your belief systems, right? Putting finances and resources behind the changes that you say you want to make. It's not this, I'm going to put up a pride flag or, black fist or something during certain occasions. It's about the long-term work. And now we see today, like, there's all this rolling back on DEI, right? Which is so frustrating and infuriating. And the other thing that is lost is trust, right? Is trust in the communities, that these changes will be sustainable, that they'll be long-lasting, that they will be genuine, it's just an interesting dynamic, and I don't understand why it's not seen. The benefits are not seen when They just seem so obvious to me.
This is deep stuff, Calvin. Because to be fair, this is like, as you were saying, this is a question I've been asking myself quite a bit. Not because people have been rolling back on DEI, because deep down, I think for me, I see it as a pendulum. It's like one day when we feel exposed, and it feels like there is a reckoning. And remember 2020, they were calling it a racial reckoning. For who? I mean, come on now. We've been aware of this stuff, but all of a sudden, it was a racial reckoning. People felt, urged. There was a sense of urgency to take action, to be seen to take action. And then, now that everything has died down, and I'm not going to say that there hasn't been an DEI work that hasn't been implemented in a way that actually assured that change was measurable, and was evident. Because we all knew that doing a pride event or doing, like a 90-minute workshop on microaggressions is not going to solve your problems, right? And I think there was an oversimplified approaches that were delivered that actually backfired. And obviously come up Mr. Trump and all of his shady vibes, and everyone now feels like they have to go and kneel to the now new ruler who is completely against what they were doing. I don't mind people going backwards and forwards, because that's just in their spirit. That's not for me. But one thing I really want to call out is us people who do this work, right? Some days it feels like actual shadow work, right? Because some of us were told to fight. Others were told to disappear. We know when we go in there what to expect. We know what happens when our voice is seen as a threat, right? And at the same time, today I'm asking myself, out of exhaustion for everything that I've endured like in the last 5 years, I'm really tired of doing work that for people who don't consider it important, right? And it goes back to this thing that you were saying at the beginning. We dream of change for others when they don't dream it or they don't see it being possible. We dream for cultures that are inclusive, that bring about change, that are healthy, that are recovery oriented, that are healing, but are also performing and productive. And at the same time, we do this work because we advocate more for others sometimes than we advocate for ourselves. What do we make of all of this? And this is maybe a question for you. Like, I'm kind of, at the moment, retallying up, what this means for myself existing in that space, specifically if your work, this space is work, but it's also your life experience that fuels this fight. What needs to change, right? Because the harm oftentimes is experienced by those of us who go on the front lines and do this work. And yet we continue to rise, we continue to fight, and at the same time, rest, as you said earlier as well, is not always a priority. So what do we do now? What do we do now? If there was something that you would say or you would share with people who are actually going through this turmoil, how do we sit with that?
I think probably giving ourselves the space to sit with that, right? I think sometimes I'm just thinking of the past couple of years, especially when you feel powerless. What you end up doing is try to do everything to kind of feel like you are making some type of change. And when I say everything, you're probably doing a full-time job, you're probably doing a couple of projects on the side, you're doing like, you're juggling all of these things.
Talks, all of that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Contributing to boards and committees and all of this type of stuff. And sometimes it's for free, sometimes you might get a little bit of compensation for it. And I think you're right that we become so exhausted. It feels like we're just this hamster on a wheel. And I think sometimes what I've I'm in a space now where I am trying to step back, pull back, and because I feel like I do need that time to kind of like sit with it and kind of determine like what do I want for the rest of my life. Like, with every day I'm getting older, right? So I've got to also imagine what I want my future to look like, and how am I going to take care of myself and make sure that I'm healthy enough to have a productive future and stuff like that. So I think we do need to give ourselves that space to sit with it, and it's kind of like a lot of, I don't know if you've heard of the 92% in America, the 92% of the black women who voted against Trump, right? They're like my fight anyone stepping back and stepping out, I'm getting a facial type of thing, because there comes a point where you have to just take care of yourself. The fight is just too hard. And the reason why we end up fighting so much and so hard is because our lives are at stake, right? The people of power, and they make these changes, their lives aren't at stake. It might be money, it might be reputation, it's probably power that's at stake, but not their lives. And I think we're fighting for something very different. We're fighting for our lives. And that is a much more exhausting fight than a fight for money or position. And we have to give ourselves permission that if we're doing the work, and I'm not saying if we're doing the work, to know, like I said before, when is it enough? I remember when having a supervisor, because even in work, we feel like sometimes as people who have experienced harm, feel like we always have to keep doing more and more and more. And I remember this one supervisor said, Calvin, what is enough? What is enough? So, that's what you have to figure out. Not when that you're getting the job done. What are you doing that is enough? Enough for you. Enough that you can do all that you can do, and you've done all that you can do because it's enough.
That's big. This is something I said. I think it was this trans person who was just an incredible corporate advocate, and they've just been everywhere, every job they've been at, and they were C-suite level, and they were just like creating space and getting people through the door and being that sounding board, being the advocate, and just the impact that they felt, with the recent kind of policies that have been imposed and laws that are actually now literally making their identity feel like it's literally is a threat to others, and even feeling like they can easily become even a threat to themselves, trying to be so confused with everything that's going on. I said to them, like, if we count, like, you've probably helped, I don't know, like 600 people. But never once do we actually stop and say, do you know what? That's good enough. Like, it feels like it's never enough because we're often in that space of survival. Because it's like, if we're running, if it's go, it means it's go. And whoever is behind me, whoever looks like me, whoever feels like me, if I'm in this space, you're rolling with me. And sometimes we forget that it can be kind of dehumanizing. And this is something I share, like, from, the position I had as within We Create Space, right? As someone who was constantly creating opportunities. I mean, like, my email box was just people sending me ideas, like, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that. Can you platform me to speak to so-and-so corporate, like, and continuously creating opportunities and finding voices and elevating those voices. I think at some point, Calvin, I'm not going to lie, it feels like I became a door. Like, expected. It was almost very dehumanizing. And I say this, and this is a realization on the back of silence that happens when you leave a specific job, when you're perceived as this door that lets through and creates. When you're no longer in that position and the silence sits with you, you really start to question, and I started to question, like, shit, what was my value truly? Was it, the energy or the opportunity? You know what I mean? Was it the intention, the purpose, the collective, or was it individuals within even our own collective that will utilize that to their own gain? Like some people I don't speak to this day, but I think sometimes we often forget that as we're quick to advocate for others, we also need to maintain a level of groundedness. And for me, there's a question coming in there as well, but one of the key emotions I feel for anyone who's a community builder, who's an advocate, is this difficulty to process anger. You know, sometimes the anger that comes from the betrayal that we feel within our own community. And I mean, today, thank God, I've had like a year and a half of working with that energy, and thank fuck for Audre Lorde, like just being so bold and black and apologetic about anger and why it's important, especially when we know historically how our anger has been policed. Like, I want to ask you, in the face of everything that you felt, you know, being called to do a job about culture, and then you're realizing that culture don't want to change, and then leaving that place and then going back and engaging with community, advocating within charities, and facing even some of those, you know, turmoils within our own communities. Like, what is your relationship with anger today, and what do you do with it?
Oh, my relationship with anger as a black man who's, you know, 5'10", you know, it's that. I think you said a mouthful. I think gosh, I'm just trying to collect my thoughts because there's so many things going through my head.
Take your time.
I am purposefully gentle, respectful, quiet, and that is I'm also naturally that way, but I'm also purposefully that way. My voice is soft. I smile a lot, or I try to smile a lot. But I am in constant fear of being seen as the angry black man. And that's because it's been used against me in times when I was advocating and fighting for justice. Or fighting for myself. And I think when you said, how do we process anger, I think, especially as a black man or a black woman, I think we're not given the permission to process anger. And for me, what does that look like? I'm going to be really open. It looks like self-harm. We internalize it. And I'm not talking about self-harm of necessarily, but it could be suicide ideation, it could be cutting, it could be alcoholism, but it could be not taking care of yourself. It could be a host of things, right? And that's when I realized the self-harm I was experiencing, that's when I started to think about, when is enough enough?
Yeah.
When do I step back? You know, because you're right. We're not given the space to be angry. I was talking to somebody. We're always angry and aggressive. We're never passionate. You know, we're never passionate and determined. We're always angry and aggressive. And that is a tactic, right? That's a tactic in order to silence us and to shut us up, and it harms us and it causes more harm. It's perpetuating more harm. It's stopping us from healing. All of these things. So I think when you talk about anger and advocacy work, I think they go hand in hand often. But it's not recognized as what do we do with it. Yeah. I think we experience it, but nobody talks about the experience of it. When you're talking about your friend that's trans, could you imagine, it's like you never can lay the fight down. Just the mere act of going to the toilet would be a battle. Yeah. Right? Something that for other people you don't even think about. As a black man walking out in the street and how I'm being perceived is a battle, or is something I have to take into consideration, right? And I think, and that's, all of these things are exhausting. All of these things are infuriating, but we're never being told that it's okay that we get angry. When we do get angry, because, and we see this when maybe black people are interacting with the police and they're angry, and rightfully so, because the thing about the police is if you're given an unlawful request, you're still with unlawful order, it's still expected that you follow it.
Yes.
No matter how much we all know it's an unlawful order, that's infuriating. That's anger provoking. But when we see these things on social media, they should have just complied. They should have just did it. They should have just, but you're angry. You're angry, and no one has given us the space to deal with that anger. And nobody is listening to us to kind of like talk it through.
Yes.
The cops don't want to hear it. The powers at hand don't want to hear it. It's just when a black person says that this is their experience, you got 5 or 6 white people saying that it's not. And maybe a couple of black people as well say this, which is also another type of infuriation.
Yeah. It makes me think, and this is kind of us like winding down the conversation, but arriving at this, kind of final chapter. And I love that we spoke about anger and the way we come about it. And one of the things for me about, reclaiming, redesigning my own inner culture, really how I want to develop like these internal recovery mechanisms like within myself, because we've been asking and putting out all the tools that we know and gathering and shaping spaces and trying to make them resilient, inclusive, and safe. But when we realize now, I think the agreement for most people I speak to is that there are no safe spaces, there are only safe people. And as such, for me, it's really about how I create safety internally, because anywhere world I've navigated, if I think about how I've coexisted with that world, there's often been, at the intersection, there's often been conflict. Even here, like I'm back home in Cote d'Ivoire, I'm in my native home, people say, well, if you're not happy in the West, go home. I am home, and still there's fucking conflict. You know what I mean? Like, the reality is we have to learn to live within that. And for me, anger has been a great part of reclaiming, like redesigning in the culture. And it's like rooting in wisdom, thinking about ancestry, because a lot of the time as well, it's like, gosh, I think I have so many problems. And I think about my 94-year-old grandma who's built an actual empire, and who was like, when she was born, the year she was born, they were face to face with, European settlers and facing into colonialism, learning a language that wasn't theirs, having their whole land being redesigned for them, and yet this woman still managed to raise 7 kids and be super successful. I'm like, okay, in comparison, I can find my way through. But one of the things I wanted to kind of explore with you as well, if we are talking about, embedding anger and this reshaping our understanding of anger, how could actually maybe conflict then become like a regenerative process, for us as people who often who stand for others, like how can we use conflict to actually soften? Do you know what I mean? Because this is a big discussion. If you think about what black women in America are doing right now, as I said, that 92% was saying, we're not marching with you. We've been telling you about this. We voted where we needed to vote. We did our part. Now we're resting. To me, it's actually almost feels like an invitation, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. How do we use conflict to soften? don't know. I think anytime you are fighting for justice and you're open to, actually, I don't know. This question is really stumping me a bit. It's really stumping me about how do you use it. I think the coming on the other end of it, coming out of it, I think definitely can soften us because we can celebrate the celebration of the victory, the celebration of the change, the changed system, the being able to kind of be in your power and know that it can make a change, I think can soften us, because I think when we pump iron, right, when we pump iron to build muscles, we don't always have to keep our muscles flexed. We can unflex them, but the power is still there, right? We've done the work, now we can relax, type of thing. We can have confidence in our power, and I think that can soften us. But that's a really interesting question, because sometimes it feels like it's just all hard. It's all hard work. And in order to have some respite is that we have to lay the fight down.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Building community within conflict.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that point that you made. Really, how it could be rooted in collective recovery, because to me, the isolation is really where the pain lies, because it feels so visceral, and sometimes it can feel so lonely in it. Whereas if we lay the conflict down, and this is one thing I've noticed being part of a recent group of Black women who are navigating these times and exploring, recovery from racialized trauma at work and things like that. It's when you lay it down, you see that it's a story that many others share, and it's not so. You still feel it, but it's less stinging. And it holds less power, because at the end of the day, if you see that there's so many other people along the same line as you who are saying actively this is wrong, who are also feeling this wrong, and are actually living to make things right, then you're not wrong. But we're often made to feel like we're wrong because we're sometimes isolated and alone when the conflict is generated. Does that make sense?
Definitely, I think part of the aim of conflict is isolation, right? And I think you're right in that that what's I say, many hands make light work. But if you also think of like the history of conflicts, the first slave uprising that happened in America was between the indentured slaves and the Black African slaves. And what the people in power did was build a divide. They said, no, you're not like the Africans. You can actually come out of slavery. You can actually earn land. You can actually be over there, right? And that was, and that caused the divide. And then, and then we still see that today. Working class people, feeling like feels like they're sometimes in conflict with Black people, right? It's just all about, a lot of the times, but we're fighting for the same thing, right? So I think definitely the purpose of conflict is to divide, and building those resources and connections I guess that kind of like counteracts that one tactic, and it kind of reinforces and makes the work lighter.
Yeah. I love that. You know, there's a wider question there, like, because we've talked a lot about conflict, and if I bring it back to the work that we do and what we talk about often is this, you know, not the concept, the practice of inclusion. And if we get more, maybe more embodied as opposed to less in theory, like, what do you think it would actually feel like if it wasn't just, if we started to view it not as like policy, but potentially even like a practice of repair?
What would it feel like? It would definitely feel inclusive. It would, I guess, what it won't do, I can say that. I said what it won't do. We will not be arguing or debating the value of human life based on what have you, whatever. And we would just be trying to work together as a society in order to move forward. But too often, the conversations seem to be about debating. And again, this is around constructs of social constructs of, who has value in the society and who doesn't, who is placed at the tops of society and who are placed in the margins or even outside of it.
Yeah.
And I think once we dismantle that, I think we'd be much further in the society that we want.
Yeah, yeah. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
It really is. So as we're kind of wrapping up the conversation, I mean, I've really loved, I've like taken so many notes here. But if we're really thinking about kind of what wants to emerge, I know we've talked about harm, we've named it, we've maybe talked a bit about hope, I guess, from people like us who are maybe sitting or either sitting or choosing not to sit, or avoiding, anger and internal conflict. And I think however valid this conflict is, we live in a time filled with conflict, so it's kind of impossible not to avoid it. But what still needs to be said, I mean, I guess if we were to wrap up, like what truth, about conflict with culture do you carry even now? Like if you were to leave us with, maybe one truth or one, maybe scar that like is being turned into seed, something you want to mold around conflict, like what could be words that you would share to anyone who's going through something?
I think it's important for us to always remember that we are our biggest resource, our biggest tool, our biggest weapon within any fight. And if we remember that, and value that, then we will always remember to protect it and to take care of it.
That's really beautiful. Do you know, Calvin, I always think about these, I'm a very visual person, and I wonder if that's the case for you, right? But if there's like a conflict image of like a metaphor that you would associate kind of conflict with, like when you see something, for me it's like I feel conflict in my feet. Like the first thing that comes to my mind, like when there's tension, there's something, the heat, it's like heat, feet, all of these things. What's that one image or like metaphor that you have to offer to frame conflict?
Conflict for me, I think I see it as darkness. I see it as darkness, and I see it as an unknown, and it's my job to shed light on it in order to dissolve the conflict, in order to dissolve the darkness.
I love that.
Or it's our goals to shed light on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. This was fun.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully we'll add another one. But I love it. I love that we got into it. So thank you so much, Calvin.
Thank you.
So,
and it looks like that it.
That's it.